I found out where my mother-in-law had seated me at my own wedding 40 minutes before I walked down the aisle. Not at the head table. Not even in the main room, really. A fold-out six-stop wedged against the swinging kitchen doors, close enough that every time a server pushed through, I'd get a blast of garlic butter and clattering trays for the rest of the night. My name card sat there in gold calligraphy, right next to my Aunt Denise and two of Daniel's coworkers I'd met exactly once. Across the room, at the family table under the string lights, sat Kimberly Ashcroft, my new husband's high school almost girlfriend, whose mother had been my mother-in-law's best friend for 30 years. Kimberly had a seat with a clear view of the dance floor. I had a seat with a clear view of a chafing dish. I stood there in my dress, holding the little cardstock chart the wedding planner handed me, and I felt my stomach drop the way it does right before you understand something you don't want to understand yet. Then I heard Margaret's voice, low, clipped, the tone she used with vendors she thought were beneath her, drift out from behind the kitchen doors talking to the catering manager. Just get through tonight. She won't be a permanent fixture, so don't worry about the good china for that table. I didn't move, I don't think I even breathed, because she was me, at my own wedding, 4 hours before I was supposed to say my vows. Quick question, and I promise I'll get back to the story. Where are you watching this from tonight, and is it storming where you are like it is here? Drop it in the comments. I read every one of them. Okay. Back to the kitchen doors and the woman on the other side of them who had just decided, out loud, that my marriage had an expiration date before it had even started. Here's the thing you need to understand about me. I'm not a dramatic person. I'm an accountant. My whole professional life is spent finding the one number in a spreadsheet that doesn't match the other numbers around it, and sitting with that discomfort until I figure out why. So when I heard those words, I didn't storm into the kitchen. I didn't confront her in my wedding dress with my curling iron still warm upstairs. I filed it away. Because I already had a small, folded piece of paper in my clutch that night, an index card with 4 sentences written on it in blue pen, sentences I'd been rehearsing in the bathroom mirror for 2 weeks. An announcement, not the kind people clap for right away, the kind that changes how a family looks at itself, and it was meant for one very specific table, not the head table, not Kimberly's table. It was meant for a 71-year-old man named Walter Whitfield, who was supposed to be sitting 3 tables from the dance floor with a glass of scotch. He wasn't supposed to be drinking on his blood thinners. I just didn't know yet that Margaret had already made sure he wouldn't be there long enough to hear it. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without knowing who these people were to me before that night went sideways. I met Daniel Whitfield 3 years ago at a tax workshop, of all places. He ran the books for his late father's custom millwork shop, Whitfield & Sons, and he'd come in looking shell-shocked after his first year doing it alone. His dad, Robert, had died of a heart attack 18 months before that, and Daniel had inherited a business he loved and paperwork he hated. I helped him untangle a Schedule C he asked me to dinner 3 days later. Margaret, his mother, was, and I want to be fair here because she wasn't a cartoon villain, she was a woman who'd lost her husband of 34 years and was white-knuckling her way through grief by controlling everything she could still control. The shop, the house, eventually the wedding. For the first year she liked me. She used to call me the responsible one like it was a compliment. She'd ask me to look over vendor contracts because, in her words, you actually read the fine print unlike my son. It was Daniel who first mentioned the trust. His father had set up $180,000 for him, proceeds from a life insurance policy and a partial buyout of the business, to be released when Daniel turned 30, or when he got married, whichever came first. It was meant for a down payment on a house or to expand the shop. Robert had structured it carefully. It required 2 signatures to release any funds. Margaret's as the surviving spouse and co-trustee, and his brother Walter's, an accountant himself, retired, who'd flown in from Sacramento for the wedding. Robert didn't trust anyone with full control of that money alone, not even his wife. I didn't understand why until later. About 4 months before the wedding, Daniel and I started talking seriously about buying a house, and he asked if I'd help him and his mother clean up the shop's books, so the accountant they used for tax season wouldn't charge them a fortune sorting through a year of receipts. I said yes without thinking twice. I'd done this kind of favor a dozen times for friends. The first few weeks were unremarkable: invoices for lumber, equipment maintenance, insurance. Then I hit a line item that repeated every month for the past year and a half. Caregiver services D raise $1,200. I asked Daniel about it, assuming it was for his grandmother who I knew had some health issues. Must be for Grandma Joan, he said. Mom handles that separately. It's not really shop stuff, but she probably just runs it through the business account for simplicity. Except it wasn't in the caregiving folder. It was coded in the business ledger under Equipment Maintenance Trust Disbursement Approved WW. Walter Whitfield. I'm an accountant. I know what a properly authorized disbursement from a trust looks like, and I know what it looks like when someone is trying to make something look properly authorized. Those are two different things, and the difference usually lives in the details nobody expects anyone to check. So, because I genuinely could not help myself, because this is the exact itch my brain has scratched since I was 19 years old doing summer bookkeeping for my uncle's hardware store, I checked. I pulled 22 months of disbursement records. 11 separate withdrawals from the trust account, ranging from $2,800 to $9,600, totaling $63,400 over the period, each one requiring, by the terms Robert had written into the trust, Walter's signature alongside Margaret's. I had seen Walter's actual signature exactly once before, on a birthday card he'd mailed Daniel the year we started dating. It was a distinctive signature, a hard downward slash on the W, almost like a checkmark, with a loop on the final D that swung back under the whole name. The signature on all 11 disbursement authorizations had a straight W, no slash, no loop. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, 2 glasses of wine in, at 11 at night, comparing a birthday card photo to scanned bank documents, feeling like I was losing my mind. Because the alternative, that someone had been forging a retired CPA's signature to pull money out of a dead man's trust for a year and a half, felt too big to just believe on a Tuesday night with a candle burning. So I didn't jump to conclusions. I'm not built that way. I told myself, get more data before you say a word to anyone. I found the vendor address listed for D. Ray's Caregiving Services. It was a UPS store mailbox 2 towns over, not a home, not a licensed home care agency, which in our state requires registration I could look up in about 4 minutes online. There was no registration under that name. I cross-referenced the phone number on 3 of the invoices. It matched a number I already had saved in my own phone. It was Richard Voss's cell. Richard had been around for about 2 years by then, introduced to me as an old friend of the family who's been such a help since Robert passed. He drove Margaret to appointments. He'd started coming to Sunday dinners. He'd apparently taken over managing the business side of things after Robert died, which I'd always found a little odd, since Robert had run a woodworking shop, not a hedge fund, and Richard's actual background, as far as I could tell from a LinkedIn profile that hadn't been updated since 2019, was in commercial insurance sales, a job he'd left under circumstances nobody talked about. I want to be honest about something. I liked Margaret still, even as I was compiling this. I kept hoping there was an explanation. Maybe Walter had verbally authorized it and someone else just signed on his behalf with permission, which happens technically if it's documented. Maybe I was about to embarrass myself in front of my future husband over a filing error. So I did the responsible thing. I didn't tell Daniel yet. He was drowning in wedding logistics and I didn't want to detonate something without being sure. I didn't confront Margaret. I made copies. I photographed the invoices, the wire transfer confirmations, the birthday card signature for comparison, and I put them in a manila folder in the console of my car, and I made a plan. After the wedding, once things were calm, I would sit down privately with Walter, the one person with both the legal standing and the financial literacy to know exactly what he was looking at, and hand him everything. Quietly, not a scene. Not at the reception. I'm an accountant, not an arsonist. That was the plan anyway, right up until Margaret sat me next to the kitchen doors and told a caterer I wasn't going to be a permanent fixture. The rehearsal dinner 2 nights earlier should have told me more than it did. Margaret gave a toast that mentioned Kimberly Ashcroft by name, who has been part of this family in spirit for so long, and did not mention my parents once, despite my mother sitting 6 feet away in a dress she'd bought specifically for that dinner. My mother laughed it off in the car afterward, the way you do when you've decided not to let something ruin your daughter's week. She's grieving Robert in her own way, my mom said. Let it go. I let it go. That's what you do when you love someone whose mother is difficult and you're trying to build a life, not a war. But there was a moment that night I keep coming back to. I walked past the hotel bar and saw Margaret and Richard huddled at a corner table, heads close together, and Richard was sliding a folded document across to her, not dramatic, not suspicious on its face, just two people going over paperwork. Except Margaret closed her hand over it fast when she saw me, and said, too brightly, "Just some final catering invoices, sweetheart, boring stuff," and I said something equally bright back. And we both smiled at each other like two people who just silently agreed not to ask the question we both knew was sitting on the table. I didn't think much of it at the time. I filed it the way I file everything. I didn't know yet how much that folded document mattered. Here's the piece I didn't understand until much later. 3 weeks before the wedding, Margaret had personally arranged Walter's travel. Booked his flight, his airport car, all of it, presenting it as a favor to her 71-year-old brother-in-law so he wouldn't have to deal with logistics. She'd booked his return flight for 9:40 that same night. The wedding, not the next morning like every other out-of-town guest. That same night, meaning his car would need to leave the reception by 7:15 at the absolute latest to make it to the airport an hour and a half away. Daniel later told me his mother had explained it as Walter's request. He doesn't like being away from his dog for more than a day, you know how he is. Walter, when I finally asked him myself months later, told me he'd never requested any such thing. He'd told Margaret he could stay through Sunday. She'd told him the return flight was already booked and non-refundable by the time he tried to change it. So on my wedding day, the one person who could read those 11 disbursement authorizations and immediately understand what he was looking at had a flight that would pull him out the door less than 3 hours into the reception. And I'd been seated by the kitchen, 40 feet and 2 rope-line sections away from wherever he ended up sitting, with a 5-piece band between us. I don't think Margaret sat down one day and mapped this out like a heist. I think it was smaller and more human than that, and somehow worse, a series of small, self-serving decisions, each one individually deniable, that all happened to point the same direction. Keep Walter's visit short. Keep the new daughter-in-law who reads fine print far from the family table. Get through the night. I just happened to be seated close enough to the kitchen to hear the wrong conversation. About 90 minutes into the reception, I went looking for my aunt, who disappeared to find a phone charger, and I ended up near the little service hallway behind the kitchen where the caterers kept extra ice and folding chairs. The swinging door was propped open a few inches, Margaret's voice again, and Richard's. "Car's coming at 7, so once Walter's in it we're clear," Richard was saying. "The last transfer clears Monday, and then it's done, it's just in the operating account. Nobody's going back through 18 months of caregiver invoices for fun." "He was never going to check anyway," Margaret said, and I could hear the exhaustion under the sharpness in her voice. The sound of someone who talked herself into something a long time ago and was just writing it out now. "Robert should never have made this so complicated. It's my money too. I earned every bit of that business as much as he did." "I know, Margie. I know. Just get me through tonight." I stood in that hallway in my wedding dress with a folder in my car that I'd built specifically to hand to the man they were currently trying to get out of the building before he could hear anything. And I understood all at once that this wasn't a filing error, and it wasn't a misunderstanding, and it wasn't something I could quietly sort out after the honeymoon. It was happening. Tonight. In about 90 minutes, whatever was left of that trust money was going to finish moving somewhere I couldn't easily trace it once it landed, and the one person with the authority to stop it was going to be in a car headed to the airport. I walked back into the reception, found my clutch at my seat by the kitchen, the seat that had put me, by pure accident of Margaret's own making, 20 feet from the exact conversation I needed to overhear, and I texted my aunt one word. "Car." I found Walter at 6:52 by the coat check, already shrugging into his jacket, his driver idling out front. I didn't have time to be graceful about it. "Walter, I need 4 minutes before you get in that car." "I'm sorry, I know it's your niece's, I need 4 minutes. To his enormous credit, he gave them to me. I walked him to a quiet stretch of the parking lot, under a light that buzzed and flickered, and I handed him copies from the folder I'd grabbed off my aunt when she pulled up 11 disbursement records, the birthday card signature, the caregiving invoices with the UPS store address, the phone number that matched Richard Voss. I watched a retired CPA's face change in real time as he went through 11 pages under a parking lot light in his good suit, and I will remember it for the rest of my life, not anger first, but a kind of stillness. The stillness of someone doing math he didn't want to be doing. "That's not my signature," he said finally, quietly. "That's not even close to my signature." "I know, $63,000. 63,400 as of the last statement I could see. There's a transfer scheduled to clear Monday that I don't have documentation for yet. I only heard about it 15 minutes ago." He looked toward the building, toward the string lights and the sound of the band starting a song I'd chosen for our first dance in about 40 minutes, and I watched him make a decision. "I'm calling my flight and canceling it," he said. "And in the morning, I'm calling the bank." I went back inside with 4 minutes to spare before Daniel started looking for me, and I put the index card back in my clutch because the announcement I'd written for that card didn't matter anymore, not the way I'd planned it. I'd written 4 gentle sentences meant to plant a seed with Walter across a dinner table, something like, "We're so grateful to have someone in the family who still believes in checking the numbers twice." A quiet nudge. A door left open for a private conversation the next week. The door didn't need opening anymore. It had been kicked in a parking lot under a flickering light. When it came time for toasts, I stood up anyway, because 140 people were watching and my husband of 6 hours was smiling at me like nothing in the world was wrong, and I wasn't going to be the person who burned this night down in front of every guest. I said the 4 sentences on the card almost exactly as I'd written them, and I watched Margaret's face when I said checking the numbers twice. Just a flicker. Just long enough for me to know that some part of her understood I knew. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table afterward and whispered, "You okay? You seem somewhere else." "I'm okay," I told him. "I'll tell you everything tomorrow," and I did. I told Daniel everything the next morning, in a hotel room with room service coffee going cold between us, and I watched my husband of one day learn that his mother had spent 18 months forging his uncle's signature to pull money out of his dead father's trust. He didn't yell, he didn't cry, not right away. He just kept saying, "Are you sure?" in a voice that wasn't really asking me. It was asking the universe to give him a different answer than the one he already knew was true. Walter called that Monday, not from a plane but from his hotel room, where he'd stayed an extra 2 nights specifically to deal with this instead of flying home to his dog. He'd already called the bank's fraud department first thing, using his authority as co-trustee to flag the account and request a hold on the scheduled Monday transfer. It cleared with about 90 minutes to spare. $91,200, the remaining balance plus what would have been the final withdrawal, stayed exactly where it was. The bank opened an internal review. Because trust fraud involving forged signatures crosses into territory banks take seriously. Not because they care about our family drama, but because it's the kind of thing that triggers their own liability. They brought in a forensic document examiner within the week to formally compare the signatures against verified samples of Walter's handwriting on file. The report came back 19 days later. I remember the date because it was the same week Daniel and I were supposed to be picking out furniture for the house we'd been planning to buy with money that, we now understood, wasn't fully there anymore. The examiner's conclusion, in language far more careful and technical than I'm using here, was that the signature on all 11 disbursement authorizations showed inconsistent formation characteristics with the known exemplars, and was unlikely to have been produced by the same author. In plain terms, not Walter's hand. Not even a good forgery, a rushed one, the kind you produce when you're confident nobody's going to hold the birthday card up next to the bank form and actually look. Walter, to his credit, didn't go straight for blood. He requested a family meeting first, him, Margaret, Daniel, a trust attorney, and Richard, if Richard would show up, which notably he did not. Richard's phone was disconnected within the week. The UPS store box for D. Ray's caregiving services was closed out the same month. He'd apparently done this kind of thing before, Walter's attorney found, through a records search. A small civil judgment against Richard from 4 years earlier in a different state, involving a similar, informal financial management arrangement with an elderly relative of a different family entirely. Nobody had ever checked. Nobody ever does until they're the ones sitting in a parking lot with a flickering light overhead. Margaret didn't run, I'll give her that much. She sat at that meeting in the trust attorney's beige conference room, and after about 40 minutes of Walter laying out dates and dollar amounts, she finally said the thing I think she'd been carrying since Robert died. He left me with a business I never asked to run alone, and locked up money I needed just as much as Daniel did, like I was a child who couldn't be trusted. I earned that money too. Every year of that marriage, I earned it. She wasn't entirely wrong, and that's the part that stuck with me longest, that grief and resentment and a genuine, real grievance about how Robert had structured his estate had all curdled. Over 3 years, into something she'd let Richard talk her into, one small justified withdrawal at a time, until it added up to $63,000 and a forged signature and a flight booked to get her own family's accountant out of the building. She didn't lose everything. The trust attorney negotiated a restitution plan instead of a criminal referral. Walter, in the end, didn't want to see his sister-in-law prosecuted. He wanted the money back and the account properly secured. Margaret agreed to repay the full $63,400 from her share of the business over 4 years, with the shop's books now requiring both Walter's and an independent bookkeeper's sign-off on anything over $500. Mine, as it happened, since I was already the one who'd caught it. It's been 14 months since that wedding. Daniel and I did eventually buy a house, smaller than we'd planned because the trust took an extra 2 years to fully restore, but ours. Margaret and I don't have the easy relationship we had that first year, before the caregiver invoices, before the seat by the kitchen doors. Some things don't fully repair, and I've stopped expecting them to. But she comes to dinner every other Sunday now, and last month she brought over a box of Robert's old woodworking sketches for the house. Designs he'd drawn for a bookshelf he never got to build, and asked, quietly, if Daniel wanted to try building it. That felt like something, not forgiveness exactly. Just a door left open the same way I'd once left one open for Walter, in 4 gentle sentences on an index card that never got used the way I planned. I think about that seat by the kitchen sometimes. How something meant to push me to the margins ended up putting me close enough to hear the one conversation that mattered. I don't think Margaret ever apologized for the seating chart itself. She apologized, eventually, for a great many bigger things, but never that. I think some part of her still believes it was a small, defensible decision on an overwhelming day. Maybe it was. People rarely see the size of their own choices while they're making them. It's only later, looking back from a house you weren't sure you'd get to keep, that you understand exactly how much one seat, one flight, one folded document passed across a bar table ever really cost.